You are not the chaos you've lived. You are the strength with which you get up every time the world tries to knock you down. This book, born as an intimate diary of someone whose life was a complete chaos, a lost soul who found an outlet, and a path to peace in their words. We don't know their name, but we do know their truth. Each page is an echo of a personal journey of someone who decided to be conscious of their actions and face their fears, putting aside masks to embrace their authenticity. Found in the depths of the internet, this book has transformed into a guide that will resonate with those who have hit rock bottom, who have dealt with their shadows, and who long for a new beginning. It doesn't offer easy answers, but difficult questions that invite us to look in the mirror and recognize our own fragility and strength. How to Master Your Mental Health. An anonymous author, navigating the depths of the mind when the wind carries away our plans and life stops for an instant. That's when we really begin to listen to the voice we carry inside. A voice that doesn't always make sense, that sometimes whispers fears and doubts, and other times, more often than we'd like, simply stays silent, as if waiting for us to be the ones to give it meaning. Since I was a child, I was always fascinated by the ocean, that vast and immense place where the waves seemed to hold ancient secrets, where each wave was a sigh of something I couldn't understand. When I stood in front of the sea, I realized that this horizon was not only out there, but also inside me. It wasn't a sea of water, but one of thoughts, of emotions that ebbed and flowed with the force of an invisible swell. But how do you navigate such a deep sea? Life sometimes feels like a ship sailing aimlessly, tossed by storms, and at times forgetting that there are also calms. We find ourselves trying to understand, to organize, to make sense of what we carry within. But how do you organize a chaos you can't see? How do you make peace with something you can't quite comprehend? It wasn't until a breaking point that I understood that it's not about fighting the swell, but about learning to dance with it, to flow with the tide, and to let each storm show us who we really are. I was once asked, why does it hurt so much when we lose control? And the answer got stuck in my throat. It's not losing control that hurts, but the idea that we once had it. We believe we have the reins of our mind, that we can tame it to our will. But the reality is that we are navigators, not captains, and the ocean, with its immensity, reminds us that sometimes it's enough to let go and to trust that the currents will take us where we need to be. On my own journey, there were times when my mind felt like a maze with no way out, where each step was an empty echo resonating in an infinite space. How can you not feel fear in that place? How can you not feel alone when the only things you hear are your own voices? But in those moments, I discovered something important. The maze isn't there to trap us, but to teach us to find our way out, to show us what we really need to leave behind. So the question arises, how willing are we to listen to what our mind has to say? Because there, in those dark corners, is where our untold stories, our silenced fears, and our forgotten hopes are hidden. I don't want this book to be just a guide. I want it to be a lighthouse, a light that reminds you that even if the ocean of our mind seems overwhelming, we can learn to navigate it. Not because we have all the answers, but because we have decided to ask ourselves the right questions. And perhaps the first question is, what am I really afraid of when I look inward? The answer to that question is not simple. It's not something we find from one day to the next. But I believe that in the act of asking ourselves, we are already moving forward. We are already taking a step toward that calm we so desperately seek. In this journey we are about to start together, we will talk about chaos and order, about dark days and moments of clarity. We will face the fears that we have refused to name, and we will discover the beauty of letting go of what no longer serves us. We will explore the unknown territories of our mind and learn to rebuild ourselves, to let go of labels, and to be reborn from the ashes of our old versions. I don't intend to give you answers, because you will find those yourself. My only wish is that when you close each chapter, you feel that you have taken one more step toward the peace you seek, that you find the strength to face your storms and the serenity to enjoy the calms. The Silent Crisis, Exploring Psychological Collapse. There are moments in life that have no clear name. They are instants when the external noise fades away, and all that remains is a void that stretches inside, as if the soul has been left speechless. It's not that we don't want to talk. It's that we no longer find a way to do it. How can you explain something that we ourselves can't even comprehend? For me, that moment came without warning. There were days when the sun was shining, and yet my inner world was cloudy. I would wake up with a weight on my chest that I didn't know how to remove, and I wondered if I would ever feel the lightness of living again. People went on with their lives. The world kept turning, but I felt like I was trapped in an eternal pause. And there an inevitable question arises. How do you face a storm that you can't see? Because psychological crises don't have a face. They don't have a defined shape. They are like a distant echo that gets closer and closer until it suddenly becomes a deafening roar. Sometimes people would ask me if everything was okay, and I would respond with an empty yes. But inside, I knew it wasn't true. The mind becomes a silent enemy, a place where thoughts become shadows that haunt us every step of the way. They say that the worst prison is the one we build for ourselves, and I think there is no greater truth than that. But how do you get out of a prison when you don't know you're inside? It's hard to explain how a mind in crisis can become a maze with no way out. What do you do when everything you know becomes an enemy, when your own thoughts become daggers that wound you from within? I found myself asking, is this real? Is it me who is living this? Or am I just a spectator of my own life? I remember one particular night when everything fell apart. There was no apparent reason. There was no tragic event or physical injury. But the pain was real. It was a pain that couldn't be seen, that couldn't be touched, but that consumed everything in its path. That night, I understood that psychological collapse is not an explosion, but a slow crumbling, like a building that falls apart brick by brick. And the question became inevitable. How do you rebuild something that has been reduced to rubble? It's easy to think that a crisis hits suddenly, but the truth is that it is silent. It comes little by little, with whispers that we ignore, with signs that we choose not to see. And when it finally manifests itself, it takes us by surprise, as if we had been expecting a storm and were surprised by an earthquake. In the midst of the chaos, a need arises to escape, to run away from everything, even from oneself. But you can't run from a mind in crisis. You live with it, you breathe with it, and the hardest part is accepting that there is no quick fix. It took me time to understand that sometimes the only way out is to go through that storm completely. Sometimes they would ask me, "Don't you feel that something has been broken forever?" And my answer, although it was difficult to give, was sincere. Yes, something has been broken, but maybe that break was necessary to build something new. On my own journey, I discovered that the crisis was not an end, but a calling to stop, to listen to the voices I had been ignoring, to face the fears that I had hidden under layers of smiles and responsibilities. The psychological crisis was not the enemy. It was a warning, an alarm that my soul had been sounding for years. The difficult thing is not accepting that we are in crisis. The difficult thing is forgiving ourselves for being there, for not having been strong enough, for having allowed life to overwhelm us. But the truth is that strength is not in avoiding collapse, but in getting up after having fallen. The crisis, the one that many don't understand because it's not visible, is a process of purification. It is a moment when life shakes you, strips you of everything you thought you were, and invites you to rebuild yourself from scratch. And in that process, you are not alone, even if you sometimes feel it. There is always someone willing to listen. There is always a hand that reaches out, even if you can't see it at the moment. Rebuilding from the ruins. Rebirth after the breakdown. They say that the real challenge is not falling, but having the courage to get up after hitting rock bottom. And sometimes, upon hitting rock bottom, we discover that the ground is not as firm as we thought, that it's more like quicksand that traps us in its silence. That was my experience after the collapse, a feeling of being lost in my own rubble, not knowing how to begin to rebuild a life that seemed to have been shattered. There is no recipe for rebuilding. There is no manual that tells us where to start. It all comes down to standing in front of our ruins and having the courage to accept that we are, at that moment, a devastated ground. It's not easy to say it or even to admit it to oneself. I'm broken, and I don't know if I'll ever be whole again. But is it really about going back to being what we were? Or maybe it's about discovering what we can be now. In the days after the breakdown, I found myself alone in my room, staring at the ceiling as if I could find answers there. But there were no answers, just a silent abyss. I realized that to rebuild, I first had to do something fundamental. Learn to forgive myself. Forgive myself for not having been strong enough, for having allowed things to get to that point, and especially, forgive myself for not knowing how to get out. How do you forgive for what you don't control? I asked myself again and again. And the answer was simpler than I expected. It's about accepting that we won't always have control and that it's okay not to have it. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is admit that we need to start over. The first step toward rebuilding was not getting up abruptly, but learning to get up slowly, step by step. I started with the smallest things, with what I thought was insignificant. I decided that each morning would be an opportunity for a new beginning, even if that beginning only consisted of getting out of bed and breathing. I understood that rebuilding was not about grand acts, but about small daily decisions that, over time, become foundations. I asked myself a question that changed me. What is left of me when everything I thought I was has collapsed? The answer, although difficult to accept, was liberating. My essence remained, naked, without masks or disguises. The presence of a human being who has been broken, but who still breathes, still feels, is still here. And if we are still here, there is something worth fighting for. Rebuilding is an intimate, almost sacred process. It's looking at yourself in the mirror and recognizing the scars, but not as a reminder of the fall, but as marks of a story that has not yet ended. And it was in those marks that I found the strength I thought I had lost. I realized that each wound was not a sign of weakness, but proof that despite everything, I was still standing. It's easy to think that the breakdown or crisis has destroyed everything, but the truth is that it has also revealed what really matters. When everything falls apart, we discover the essential, what is truly worth keeping. And that's where I began to build. From the essential, from what made me feel alive, even if it was in a different way. How do you know what to rebuild and what to leave behind? I asked myself. And the answer is not always clear. But I believe it's about listening to yourself, about asking yourself what still makes you feel something, even if it's a small spark. In my case, that spark was to start writing again, to reconnect with words, even if at first I didn't know how to do it. I decided to rebuild my life around what still made sense to me and to leave behind what only anchored me to pain. Rebuilding is not easy. There are days when the ruins seem too heavy to lift, moments when hopelessness becomes an unexpected visitor. But those moments are not a failure. They are part of the process. They are reminders that we are not alone, that the internal struggle is something we all face in one way or another. Rebirth is not an act of grandiose courage. It is a slow and constant process. It is allowing something new to emerge in the midst of the destruction, not something perfect, not something unbreakable, but something real. because life is not about being perfect, but about being human, with all that implies: doubts, fears, dreams, and hopes. The art of deconstruction, breaking old identities. There was something in me that didn't fit, something I couldn't quite define but had been feeling for years. It was like an old, tight suit, a skin that no longer belonged to me, and yet I clung to it tightly, as if letting it go would mean losing myself. But what happens when what we cling to is nothing more than a false idea of what we think we are? In those moments, I found myself asking, what am I really? And each time I did, the answers that came were echoes of other people's voices. It was as if my identity was built with bricks that others had put in place, pieces of a puzzle I hadn't chosen. And I realized something painful but necessary. To discover who I am, I first had to deconstruct, to break every layer of what I thought I was. Deconstruction is not easy. It's not about destroying ourselves, but about getting rid of what we never really were, about letting go of those expectations, those labels that were put on us since we were children, those words that we heard and accepted as absolute truths. But how do you break with something that has been with us for so long? One afternoon, while walking through a neighborhood in my city, I stopped in front of a house in ruins. It was evident that at one time it had been beautiful and strong, but now all that remained were remnants of what it once was. As I looked at it, I felt an inexplicable connection. I saw myself reflected in those fallen walls, in those bricks scattered on the ground. I felt that, just like that house, I was in the middle of a process of collapse. How do you rebuild something that is no longer useful? Was the question that came to my mind. And the answer came to me like a whisper. It's not about rebuilding it, but about building something new from its foundations. But for that, you first have to let go of what is no longer useful, what no longer holds up. I decided that it was time to start breaking with old identities. The first one I let go of was the idea of being invincible, of having to be strong all the time. I grew up believing that showing weakness was a failure, that asking for help was a sign of defeat. But then I understood that true strength is in being vulnerable, in showing those broken parts and not being ashamed of them. The art of deconstruction is not a battle, it is a dance. It is a process of unlearning what we have learned, of shedding layers and letting the essential come to light. But how do you know what that essence is? How do you differentiate what we are from what we have been taught to be? I believe the answer is in the silence. In those moments when we dare to be alone with ourselves, without distractions, without noise. It was in those silences that I found answers I had been avoiding. I realized that many of the labels I wore were not mine, but belonged to others, to a society that expects us to fit into molds, to people who thought they knew who I should be. It was a painful process, because letting go of what I always thought I was is like dying, in a way, but at the same time I felt liberated. It was like taking a weight off my shoulders, like breathing fresh air after having been in a closed room for too long. Then I asked myself, who am I if I am not what I always thought? And the answer, although uncertain, was exciting. I am someone in process, someone in constant evolution. I am not a fixed identity. I am not a label. I am a human being in search of authenticity. And that is enough. Deconstruction is an art because it requires patience, sensitivity, and a lot of courage. It's learning to let go of what limits us and embracing what we really want to be, even if we don't know exactly how to do it. It's allowing ourselves to fail, to make mistakes, and to try again and again until we feel that we are closer to our truth. On my own journey, I discovered that breaking old identities doesn't mean rejecting our past, but learning from it. It means looking with compassion at the person we were and thanking them for getting us this far. But it also implies having the courage to let them go with love to make room for who we are destined to be. Caring for time and space, the magic of Personal organization, I have always felt a fascination for sunrises. There is something magical about watching how the light slowly filters through the darkness, illuminating what was, just a few minutes ago, wrapped in shadows. It's as if the day gives us a new opportunity, a new beginning to order the chaos that sometimes invades our lives. I remember a stage in my life when everything felt out of place. My mind was a mess, a constant storm of thoughts with no direction, and my surroundings were no different. Stacked papers, commitments to fulfill, days that flew by while I remained stuck in the same place. It was at that moment that I realized that the external mess was a reflection of my internal chaos. How do you organize the external world when the internal one is broken? I asked myself. And although I didn't have a clear answer then, I knew that I had to start somehow. It was a friend who, without knowing it, gave me an important lesson. He used to tell me that his way of staying calm was to have an organized space, a place that allowed him to breathe and think with clarity. At first, I thought it was a simple cleaning habit, but then I understood that it was much more than that. It wasn't about being tidy for the sake of it, but about creating an environment that reflected the peace I wanted to feel inside. So one day, I decided to try it. I got up early, opened the windows, and let the fresh air carry away some of that weight I was carrying. I sat in front of my desk and started to organize the papers that I had accumulated for months. It wasn't just a matter of cleaning. It was a symbolic act of putting in order what I had left in chaos for too long. As I put each thing in its place, I asked myself, what else in my life needs to be ordered? The answer was obvious. My priorities, my time, my mental space. I understood that organizing was not just a physical task, but a profound exercise in reflection and self-care. Caring for our time and space is an art. It's knowing how to say no to what doesn't nourish us and yes to what really matters. It's learning to value those moments of calm, those small breaths between the whirlwind of the day-to-day. But how do you care for our time in a world that constantly pushes us to go faster, to do more things? I think the key is in learning to be intentional with our minutes, with our actions, with our thoughts. It's not about filling every hour with tasks, but about giving them a purpose, about allowing ourselves to take breaks, breathe, and be aware of where we are and where we want to go. During that process of organization, I discovered something curious. The more I organized my space, the more clarity I found in my thoughts. It was as if by clearing the physical clutter, my mind was also clearing little by little. I learned that the space we inhabit has a direct impact on how we feel, on how we see the world, and on how we see ourselves. Then I asked myself a crucial question. What really deserves my time and my attention? And by doing so, I realized that I had been spending too much energy on things that gave me nothing, on commitments that didn't make me happy, on people who only drained me. I decided to start caring for my time, as I care for my health, as something sacred and valuable. Organizing is not just a matter of calendars or to-do lists. It is an act of self-love, of giving ourselves the space to be, to breathe, to exist without the pressure of having everything under control. It's learning to let go of perfectionism and accept that chaos is sometimes inevitable, but that it doesn't mean we have to live in it. On my own journey, I discovered that caring for my time and my space not only gave me peace, but also allowed me to be more authentic, more present. It was like clearing a path full of weeds, and at the end, finding a place where I could sit and simply enjoy being there. The search for balance. How to handle social pressure. Sometimes life feels like a tightrope, a thin path that we cross with our eyes blindfolded, trying not to fall into the abyss of other people's expectations. We strive to maintain our balance, to live up to what others expect of us while carrying the weight of our own dreams and fears. But how do we stay firm when social pressure pushes us from side to side? On one occasion, A friend told me that life is like a dance, and that sometimes we let ourselves be carried away by the music of others, forgetting our own melody. I laughed at the time, but later I found myself thinking about those words. What melody am I following? I asked myself. And the answer was uncomfortable. It wasn't mine. I remember that for a stage of my life, I was constantly trying to please everyone. It was as if my worth depended on the approval of others, on meeting their expectations, on being what they needed me to be. I was so worried about fitting in that I stopped asking myself if the place I was in really belonged to me. One night, while walking through the empty streets of my city, I stopped in front of a window and observed my reflection. I didn't fully recognize myself. The smile I was wearing was the one that others wanted to see, but in my eyes, there was a deep tiredness, a feeling of emptiness that I couldn't fill. It was at that moment that I asked myself a fundamental question. Who am I when no one is watching? Social pressure can be a constant weight, an expectation that we carry without realizing it. Sometimes it comes in the form of looks, other times in words disguised as advice, and many times in that constant fear of disappointing others. But for how long can we sustain a life that doesn't belong to us? I decided that it was time to seek my own balance, to stop being an acrobat on the tightrope of other people's expectations, and to find my center in the midst of the chaos. The question was not whether I could please everyone, but whether I was willing to set aside my own desires to fulfill those of others. The answer, although difficult, was clear. No. I understood that finding balance is not about juggling what others expect of us, but about learning to let go of what doesn't serve us. It's allowing ourselves to be imperfect, vulnerable, human. It's saying no without guilt and saying yes only to what truly nourishes us. How do you find balance in a world that demands so much of us? That was the question a young man asked me at a talk I gave some time ago. He looked at me with eyes full of doubts, waiting for a definitive answer. But all I could offer him was my own experience. I told him that to find my balance, I had to learn to listen to myself, to be honest with myself about what I really wanted. I had to let go of the fear of not fitting in, of not meeting the expectations of my family, my friends, society, and face the discomfort of being authentic. It wasn't easy, but it was liberating. On my own journey, I discovered that handling social pressure is not about eliminating it completely, but about learning to live with it without letting it consume us. It's like learning to walk in the middle of a storm, with our feet firm on the ground and our mind focused on our destination. The key is to remember that we should not be what others expect of us, but what our soul needs us to be. Learning to say no was one of the most difficult steps. At first, I felt like I was disappointing everyone around me, that I was selfish for choosing my own well-being. But over time, I understood that caring for myself was not a selfish act, but a necessary one, because if we are not well with ourselves, we cannot be well with others. Social pressure will always be there, whispering to you. But we must learn to silence those voices and listen to our own, to find a balance that is not based on what others want, but on what we really need. The pursuit of balance is a continuous journey, a constant dance between who we are and who we want to be. It is not about achieving a state of perfection, but about allowing ourselves to flow with life, to be flexible, to be kind to ourselves when we stumble. Finding purpose in the chaos. They say there are times when life feels like a whirlwind, an unstoppable chaos that drags us along, leaving us breathless and without clarity. And in the middle of that storm, the only thing we want is to find a refuge, a place where we can feel safe. But sometimes that refuge is not on the outside. It is within ourselves, waiting to be discovered. There was a stage in my life when I was completely lost. It was as if every day were an automatic routine, a succession of meaningless moments, of tasks completed out of obligation, and of smiles drawn out of habit. And I wondered, how did I get here? At what point did I deviate so far from what I really wanted to be? The truth is that sometimes life takes us on paths we don't consciously choose. We let ourselves be carried away by inertia, by what is expected of us, and we forget to ask ourselves a crucial question. Am I living my truth? It was in an instant of absolute honesty with myself that I knew I was not. I remember that in the midst of that chaos, I decided to seek a moment of calm. I walked away from everything, turned off my phone, and went to a place that had always brought me peace, an old park full of trees where fallen leaves accumulated on the ground and the wind whispered stories through the branches. I sat on a bench and closed my eyes, hoping to find an answer in the silence. Who am I really? I repeated that question over and over until I stopped looking for rational answers and allowed myself to feel. It was then that something inside me awakened, like a spark that had been dormant for a long time. It was not about finding a clear answer, but about reconnecting with my essence, about remembering what really moved me, what made my heart beat strongly. Reconnecting with our essence is not something that is achieved from one day to the next. It is a process of internal listening, of allowing yourself to be honest with yourself, even if it hurts. Sometimes life pushes us to be so many things that we forget to be simply human. We forget that our essence is not in what we do, but in what we feel, in what inspires us, in those moments when we feel completely alive. On my own journey, I understood that to find purpose in the midst of chaos, I first had to stop resisting it, to stop trying to control everything and learn to flow with what life presented to me. The question was not how to avoid chaos, but how to find meaning in it. Someone once asked me, how do you know what your purpose is? And the truth is that I don't believe that purpose is something that is found suddenly, as if it were hidden, waiting to be discovered. I believe that purpose is something that is built day by day, in every small act, in every conscious choice. It is allowing ourselves to listen to our heart and follow its beats, even when we don't have all the answers. Reconnecting with our essence implies letting go of what we are not, letting go of the masks that we have worn for so long, and being authentic, even if that means showing ourselves to be vulnerable, because only from that vulnerability can we find what really moves us, what gives meaning to our days. In that park, in the middle of the fallen leaves, I asked myself another question. What makes me feel alive? The answer was not a list of achievements or goals, but simple moments. Writing, connecting with others, being in nature, sharing a sincere laugh. I realized that in the midst of the chaos, those small moments were my refuge, my way of reconnecting with what really mattered. I understood that purpose is not a final destination, but a path that is traveled with each step. It is learning to listen to our heart in the midst of the noise, to find beauty in the everyday, and to trust that even if we don't have all the answers, we are where we need to be. Reconnecting with our essence is not an easy task, but it is fundamental to living a full life. Because at the end of the day, what really matters is not how much we have achieved, but how authentic we have been with ourselves. Between freedom and routine. Redefining healthy habits. Sometimes life seems like a constant swing between the need for freedom and the security of routine. On the one hand, we yearn for that feeling of being free, of breaking with structures and simply flowing. But on the other, we know that without a firm foundation, it's easy to get lost in the chaos. This struggle between freedom and routine is a dance that we have all found ourselves in at some point, and I was no exception. On one occasion, I found myself overwhelmed by the monotony of my days. I would wake up with the same sun coming through the window, follow the same steps, and at the end of the day, I felt that nothing had changed, that everything was a meaningless repetition. Is this all there is? I asked myself, not knowing if it was my routine that was failing or if it was I who had forgotten the purpose behind it. The truth is that habits are a powerful tool, but also a dangerous trap. When we build them with intention, they guide us. But when we follow them without question, they imprison us. I decided that it was time to redefine my habits, to understand what I was doing out of inertia and what was really helping me to grow. I realized that I had fallen into a routine that no longer reflected my values or my priorities. It was like wearing a shirt that was too small for me, one that made me uncomfortable, but that I didn't dare to change. It was then that I began to ask myself, what habits bring me closer to the life I want to live? The answer was not immediate, but over time I began to discover what things made me feel good, what actions really nourished my body and my mind, and which were simply a way of escaping discomfort. In that search, I came across an uncomfortable truth. I had been using routine as a refuge to avoid facing my fears, to avoid leaving my comfort zone. I had clung to it because it gave me the illusion of control, but the reality is that it was moving me away from the freedom of being who I really wanted to be. Changing habits is not easy. It is a slow process full of setbacks and moments of doubt. But I learned something valuable on that path. It's not about changing everything from one day to the next, but about being aware of each choice, about taking one step at a time toward a life more aligned with our essence. One morning, while meditating in front of the sea, I asked myself a fundamental question. What does it mean to be free? At first, I thought that freedom was simply doing whatever I wanted without restrictions. But I realized that true freedom is not the absence of limits, but the ability to choose consciously. Freedom is in creating habits that reflect our intentions, that bring us closer to who we really want to be. On my own journey, I discovered that healthy habits are not an external imposition, but a choice. They are a way of taking care of ourselves, of honoring our body and our mind, of creating a safe space to grow. But that doesn't mean that we have to be rigid or demanding with ourselves, because a habit that becomes an obligation loses its purpose and becomes a chain. I was once asked, how do you know what habits to keep and what to let go of? And although I don't have a definitive answer, I believe that the key is in the intention. If a habit fills you with peace, if it makes you feel connected with yourself and with what surrounds you, it is a habit worth cultivating. But if it generates anxiety or guilt, maybe it's time to question it. In my case, I learned to embrace flexibility in the midst of structure. I discovered that it's okay to change my mind and adjust the course, and that the most important thing is to be present in each action, to be conscious of each decision. Life is not about following a rigid list of tasks, but about creating a space where we can be authentic, vulnerable, and free. Redefining my habits was an act of self-love. It was giving myself permission to change, to let go of what no longer served me, and to create a routine that reflected my truth. Because in the end, habits are nothing more than tools, and we are the ones who decide how to use them. The value of community, surrounding yourself with people who add to your life. They say that we are the sum of the people with whom we share our lives. Those who surround us have the power to lift us up or to drag us into the shadows. And sometimes we find ourselves walking through life without realizing how influential the voices we choose to listen to are. It took me time to understand it. But today I know that community is a mirror in which we reflect and build our own identity. There was a time in my life when I found myself completely alone, not for lack of people, but for lack of genuine connection. I was surrounded by many voices, but few were authentic. I got lost in superficial conversations, in relationships that filled empty spaces but did not nourish my soul. And in that disguised loneliness, I asked myself a question that changed my perspective. Who are the people who really add to my life? Community is not just a group of people. It is a refuge. It is the place where we find resonance, where our stories meet and intertwine. But to get there, we must first learn to listen, to open up, and to be vulnerable, because genuine connection does not arise from pride or masks, but from honesty and compassion. I remember a day when I felt overwhelmed by my thoughts. I went for a walk in the park, looking for clarity in the midst of the noise. As I passed a bench, I saw an old man sitting looking at the horizon as if he were waiting for something or someone. I decided to sit next to him without saying a word. We remained in silence, sharing a loneliness that needed no explanations. Sometimes the deepest moments are not those in which many things are said, but those in which we share silence with someone who understands. It was on that afternoon that I understood that community is not just about having people around, but about having souls with whom we can be ourselves. How do you find people who add to your life? I asked myself. And the answer that emerged from that encounter was simple. First, you have to be a person who adds. Over time, I learned to be more conscious of the relationships I chose to maintain. It was not about having many friends, but about having people who inspired me to be a better version of myself. Surrounding yourself with people who add to your life does not mean looking for perfect people, but looking for souls that encourage us to grow, to heal, and to be authentic. I realized that to have a community that adds, I first had to be honest with myself and with others. Sometimes that meant letting go of relationships that no longer contributed, even if it hurt. It meant being conscious of my own energy and how it influenced those around me, because community is a constant exchange, and what we give is what we receive. How do you know if someone is adding or subtracting from your life? I was once asked. And my answer, although not definitive, came from my own experience. Listen to how you feel after being with that person. If you feel peace, if you feel stronger, if they inspire you to be better, then you are in the right place. But if, on the contrary, you feel that your dreams are fading, that your strength is draining, maybe it's time to rethink that relationship. Learning to surround yourself with people who add is not an easy task. It requires courage to let go, to set boundaries, and to open yourself up to new connections. But when we do it, we find a sense of belonging that transcends words. We discover that life is not just about walking the path on our own, but about having someone to share the achievements and the falls with. On my own journey, I discovered that community is one of the most important pillars of well-being, because in moments of doubt, pain, or celebration, we need someone to be there to listen to us, to accompany us in silence, or to laugh together in the midst of chaos. Community reminds us that we are not alone, that our stories intertwine with those of others, and that together we can find a greater purpose. Surrounding yourself with people who add is an act of self-love and of love toward others. It is learning to be selective with our energies and generous with our presence. It is being willing to give and receive support, to share the burdens and the dreams, and to build a safe space where we can be authentic. Beyond the diagnosis, understanding the nuances of the mind. The human mind is a vast ocean, full of currents, and tides that rise and fall with an intensity that we sometimes fail to control. And just like an ocean, it is not something that we can fully understand with maps or definitions. Throughout my life, I have realized that beyond the names we give to our internal storms, there is a world of emotions, stories, and silences that we do not always manage to translate. I remember when I was given my first diagnosis. It was a mixture of relief and confusion. Relief because there was finally a word to describe what I was feeling, and confusion because that word alone did not encompass everything that I was. What does it mean to be labeled? I asked myself. I felt that I was being put in a box, a limited space, and although that box could be useful for understanding, it did not reflect my complexity as a human being. I am not against diagnoses. I believe they are important for knowing ourselves, for seeking help, and for healing. But I also believe that we must go beyond them, that we must understand that we are more than a name or a condition. The mind has nuances, shades of gray that are not always seen with the naked eye, and it is there that our humanity resides. Once a friend confessed to me that she felt like a prisoner of her diagnosis, as if she could no longer be more than that. She looked at me with eyes full of doubt and asked me, "How can I be free if I am always defined by this?" The question resonated within me because I had also felt that burden, that weight of being seen only by a part of me and not by my totality. I answered her with what I had learned on my own path. We are not a diagnosis. We are the story that exists behind it. Because beyond anxiety, depression, or any other name, there is a unique story full of moments of victories and failures, of lights and shadows that deserve to be heard. I realized that many times we fall into the trap of defining ourselves by our storms. We identify so much with our struggles that we forget the sun that we carry within. I myself had labeled myself for years, believing that my fears were what defined me. But one day, while writing in my diary, I asked myself a question that changed my perspective. What am I when my fears are not at the center of my life? It was in that search for answers that I understood something fundamental. The mind is not an enemy to be defeated, but a terrain that we must learn to know. Each thought, each emotion is a signal that invites us to explore, to listen to what our soul needs to tell us. I learned that understanding the nuances of the mind implies being compassionate with ourselves, accepting that we won't always have clarity and that it's okay to feel lost, because in those moments of darkness is where we can find the opportunity to know ourselves more deeply, to see ourselves without filters or judgments. On my journey, I met many people who carried their diagnosis as a stigma, as a mark that prevented them from being free. And I understood that my purpose was to remind us that we are much more than a label, that behind each diagnosis, there is a human being with dreams, with passions, with a life that deserves to be lived to the fullest. I don't want this chapter to be a denial of the realities we face, but an invitation to see ourselves beyond them, to understand that our minds are complex, yes, but also beautiful, that we are not defective for feeling broken, but brave for continuing to seek light in the midst of our shadows. How do you accept your mind just as it is? I asked myself on many occasions. And the answer, although not always easy to apply, emerged with clarity. By accepting that every part of us, even the ones we don't understand, has something to teach us, that our emotions, no matter how intense or confusing they may be, are guides that show us what we really need to heal. Understanding the nuances of the mind is learning to live in peace with our duality, to accept that we can be strong and vulnerable at the same time, that we can have fear and still move forward. It's stopping seeing ourselves as a problem to be solved and starting to see ourselves as a story in constant evolution. The power of decisions, knowing how to say no and giving up. What is harmful? There comes a moment in life when we must choose what weight we want to continue carrying and what we must leave behind. Sometimes the decisions we make feel like small, almost imperceptible turns in our path, but other times those decisions are like bridges we burn, acts of courage in which we finally free ourselves from what has been holding us back. In my case, learning to say no was a slow process full of doubts and fears. For a long time, I was one of those people who said yes to everything. Yes to commitments that didn't fulfill me. Yes to relationships that wore me down. Yes to burdens that did not belong to me. It was as if I was afraid of disappointing, of not meeting other people's expectations. But with every yes I gave out of obligation, I got a little more lost in a sea of other people's expectations and commitments that did not belong to me. One day, while I was sitting in my room with an endless to-do list, I asked myself, why is it so difficult to say no? The answer was simple but painful. Because I was afraid of losing. I was afraid of being misunderstood. I was afraid of seeming selfish. But sometimes, The true generosity toward oneself is learning to say no in order to be able to say yes to what really matters. On my journey, I discovered that saying no is not a rejection of others, but an affirmation of ourselves. It is choosing our peace over the approval of others, our well-being over exhaustion, our truth over expectations. Learning to say no was realizing that I couldn't be everything to everyone, and that it was okay to set boundaries to protect what was good for me. Someone once asked me, "How do you decide what to give up?" And although there is no single answer, I learned that the key is in listening to our inner self, in being honest with what we really need. Many times we carry things that we believe we must endure out of obligation, out of fear of change, or out of simple inertia. But the truth is that we are not here to please everyone, but to live in accordance with our essence. Saying no implies giving up, and the word give up usually has a negative connotation. We have been taught to see giving up as a failure, as a sign of weakness. But in reality, giving up what is harmful is an act of courage, an act of self-love, because only by letting go of what hurts us can we make space for what really nourishes us. On my own path, I had to give up relationships that no longer contributed to me, jobs that drained me, and expectations that were not mine. At first, it was painful, because letting go means facing the void, the fear of not knowing what will come next. But I understood that I couldn't continue holding on to what was hurting me out of fear of the unknown. Life, just like nature, needs space to grow, and that space is only created when we let go. I asked myself again and again, how do you know when it's time to let go? And the answer came in the midst of the silence. When something becomes a burden instead of an inspiration, it's time to let go. When something no longer makes us feel alive, when it steals our peace and joy, it's time to say no. The power of decisions lies in our ability to choose consciously, to be faithful to ourselves even when the world asks us to do the opposite. Saying no is not rejecting others, but protecting our sacred space, that place where we can be ourselves without fear of being judged or rejected. Learning to give up what is harmful taught me that we don't always have to go forward with everything we carry. Sometimes bravery is not in resisting, but in letting go of guilt, shame, the fear of disappointing, and trusting that by letting go, we are opening ourselves to new possibilities. Constant transformation, embracing change as part of growth. They say that the only constant in life is change, but we rarely prepare to accept it. I have always been fascinated by the river's ability to follow its course, to flow without resistance, and adapt to the stones it finds in its path. Throughout my life, I have learned that we are also like that river, that we need to learn to flow with the currents of change, even if it is sometimes difficult for us to let go of what we already know. I remember a time when I felt that my life was completely out of control. I had lost the stability that I so valued and found myself facing a series of unexpected changes. The feeling was overwhelming, as if every wave that came washed away what I had built. I wondered, why does everything have to change? That question carried a weight of frustration and fear. I had hoped to find a place where I could hold on, but that place did not exist outside of me. It was in the midst of that storm of uncertainty that I understood that change is not an enemy, but a teacher who comes to show us what we don't want to see. I realized that many times we cling to what we know out of fear of the unknown, and in that act of resistance, we lose the opportunity to grow. In a conversation with a friend, while we were sharing a coffee in silence, he asked me, "What does it take to accept change?" And what came from my soul was this: it takes trust that everything that is happening, even what you don't understand, has a purpose. Saying it was simple, but living it took me time. Accepting constant transformation implies letting go of the need to have everything under control and trusting that even if we don't know where the current is taking us, we are moving forward. We won't always know what to do, and that's okay. We won't always have clarity, and that's okay too. Life, just like us, is in constant evolution. At first, it was hard for me to let go of the version of myself that no longer fit the life I was living. I clung to my old certainties, to the people who were once fundamental, and to the dreams that I had built on fragile foundations. But I understood that holding on to what was no longer real was holding back my own growth. It was then that I asked myself, what is it that I don't want to let go of, even though I know I must? The answer was painful. My old ideas, my need for approval, my fear of failure. But at the same time, it was liberating, because once you recognize what is holding you back, you can begin to let it go. On my own journey, I learned that constant transformation is not a straight path, but a series of curves, of unexpected detours and surprises that take us out of our comfort zone. And in those curves, in those moments of uncertainty, is where we discover our true strength. Someone once told me, I can't handle so much change. I feel lost. And I understood because I had also felt that loss, that confusion of not knowing who I was in the midst of so much movement. I replied with what I had learned. It's not about not getting lost. It's about finding new parts of yourself in the process. Because change not only brings goodbyes, but also brings welcomes. It invites us to meet versions of ourselves that we never imagined, to explore paths that were not in our plans, and to discover that we are more resilient than we think. Embracing change as part of growth does not mean not feeling fear or pain, but being willing to transform through them. It is learning to see each experience as an opportunity to evolve, to leave behind what no longer serves us, and to open ourselves to new possibilities. Because every transformation, no matter how small or painful, brings us closer to the person we are destined to be. Testimonials of survival, lessons in resilience. Sometimes, when we find ourselves in the middle of a storm, it is difficult to imagine that we will get to the other side. We feel trapped, lost among the waves, believing that this time, maybe the tide is stronger than us. But it is in those moments when the stories of others, those who have survived their own storms, become lighthouses that illuminate the path. The following is a translation of the provided text from Spanish to English, Our Path. And that's how it was for me when life pushed me to the limits of my strength. During an especially dark period, a friend shared his story with me. He told me how, after losing everything, he found the strength to get up and rebuild. It wasn't a story of sudden success, no, or of dazzling achievements. It was a story of falls and risings, of gray days and small victories. He looked me in the eye and said, "Sometimes, the simple act of continuing to breathe is already a victory." That conversation was etched in my mind. I realized that we often underestimate our capacity to survive, to adapt, and to resist what breaks us. We compare ourselves to the successes of others, to stories of triumph that seem distant, and we forget that true resilience is not always measured in great achievements, but in the simple act of not giving up. On my own journey, I have met people who have lived experiences that defy logic, people who, despite having been beaten down by life, found a way to move forward. I remember a special encounter in a support group where an older man shared his story of loss. He had lost his family in an accident and for years lived immersed in darkness. But in his voice, there was a calmness that contrasted with the gravity of his words. Someone asked him, "How were you able to keep going?" He smiled with melancholy and replied, "It's not about forgetting. It's about learning to carry the pain in a lighter way." That answer made me understand something profound. Resilience is not ignoring pain. It is learning to walk with it, to carry it without letting it consume us. Throughout my life, I have realized that we all carry scars, some visible and others not so much, and each of those scars tells a a lesson that we have learned through experience. Resilience is not an innate quality, it is a process, a continuous learning. It is discovering in the midst of losses that we still have something to offer, that we can still rebuild ourselves. I have found myself asking many times, why do some people manage to get ahead while others get lost in the darkness? And the answer is not simple, but I believe that the key is in the small daily decisions. In those moments when we choose to take one more step, even if we don't know where it's taking us. I have learned that resilience is not a matter of strength, but of acceptance. Accepting that we won't always have all the answers, that there will be days when we doubt everything, even ourselves, and that it's okay to feel that way. Because true resilience is not measured by the absence of doubts, but by the ability to keep going despite them. On my path, I have found testimonials from people who have shown me the importance of being vulnerable, of opening up to others, and sharing our stories. Because when we do, we create a bridge between our pain and the hope of others. And it is in that act of sharing that we discover that we are not alone, that our scars can become a guide for those who come after. Someone once asked me, "How do you know you're resilient?" And my answer was this: because I have learned to embrace my wounds, to accept my falls, and to get up each time with more compassion toward myself. The lessons of resilience are not written in great books. They are etched in the soul of every person who has faced their shadows and found the light. Resilience is not about not breaking, but about being brave enough to pick up the pieces and create something new. It is finding meaning in the midst of chaos and choosing, over and over again, to keep moving forward. Peace of mind as a life. Goal. I have always believed that peace of mind is not a place we arrive at, but a state we constantly return to. It is that corner within us where storms dissipate and where noise turns into silence. But finding that place is not simple, and for a long time I looked for it externally, in achievements, in relationships, in an endless number of experiences that promised to fill that void. And in that process, I found myself asking, where is the peace I so long for? Throughout this journey, I have learned that peace of mind is not the absence of problems, but the ability to remain calm in the midst of them. It's not about not having fear, but about not letting fear paralyze us. It is a deep sigh, a pause in the midst of the chaos, a space where we can be authentic, vulnerable, and free of masks. I remember a conversation I had with someone I deeply admired for her serenity. I always wondered how she managed to maintain that peace in the midst of the difficulties that life inevitably brings. One day, unable to contain my curiosity, I asked her, "How do you manage to be so at peace?" She smiled at me and answered, with something that changed the way I saw life. Peace is not something you find. It's something you build within yourself, a little each day. Those words stayed with me because they made me understand that peace was not an unattainable goal, but a conscious choice we make moment by moment. Throughout this book, we have talked about falls and risings, about breaking and rebuilding, about fears and courage. And each of those chapters has been a search for that peace that we all long for. But in the end, peace of mind is not about finding definitive answers, but about learning to make peace with our questions. I have learned that peace is found in accepting our imperfections, in embracing our scars, and in letting go of what we cannot control. It is allowing ourselves to be human, with all that implies. Days of doubt and days of certainty, moments of chaos and moments of clarity. Because life is not a straight line, but a path full of curves, and peace is not found in reaching the end, but in walking with gratitude and presence. How do you find peace in the midst of the noise? I was once asked, and my answer was this: by closing your eyes and listening to what is inside you, even if what you find is not what you expected. Because to find peace, we must first learn to listen to ourselves, to be honest with ourselves about what really worries us, what we really want, and what we really need to let go of. Peace of mind, I believe, is the result of living a life aligned with our essence, of being faithful to ourselves even when that means making difficult decisions or breaking with what no longer serves us. It is learning to live in balance, not in perfection, and to find beauty in the simple things. On my own journey, I have discovered that peace is not a destination that we finally arrive at one day, but a process of constant return. A return to our center, to what really matters, to the people we love, and to the dreams that inspire us. It is learning to let go of control, to stop fighting the inevitable, and to trust that even if we don't always understand the path, we are exactly where we need to be. We have reached the end of this journey together, but the path to peace of mind is one that never ends. Because every day is an opportunity to choose calm over chaos, gratitude over complaint, and love over fear. And even if we sometimes stumble and lose our way, we can always start over. We can always choose peace again. Peace of mind as a life. Goal does not mean not having problems, but having the courage to face them with compassion toward ourselves. It is learning to be patient with our imperfections, to be kind to our shadows, and to celebrate our small victories.